So with me here is Karolina. She works for the DesignLab at the University of Twente and is really a specialist in responsible design solutions. And I am at the geoscience department, but have a very strong migration background. So in bringing those two specialities together, we've been wondering about this question: can border AI be trustworthy for migrants? And we're really going to be exploring that from by first sort of sketching out the problem of why is the border context so particular and why do we need to take it particularly into account, to then thinking about whether what we're left with is really a design problem. And we'll look at that from two perspectives. One is from current legislation as it is in place and what that has to say about this question of design. And then also from this responsible design angle, to eventually come to some conclusions at the end of the presentations on what we think the answer to that initial question on whether border AI can be trustworthy for migrants might be. So maybe just on this question of sketching out a problem, without wanting to repeat some of the ideas that people have already been presenting today, we have this idea that biometrics and in particular in a border control market are really set to grow quite a bit in terms of a market share that is out there. But at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, are there potential drawbacks on this? And that overshadow the more seamless idea of moving through borders only with having parts of your body recognized by technology as being eligible to move through those border spaces. So what we're kind of thinking about more specifically, to just give you an idea of what we talk about when we talk about border biometrics or border AI, is then we're talking about AI-supported biometric identity technologies that are developed for, or for that matter, developed for some other purpose, but still used in a border context. And these border contexts might be propping up in situations like the airport, but they might also be propping up in everyday city life, for example, if those identity questions are being sort of taken into account. So there are systems that use biometric and behavioral patterns to identify and exclude from cross-border mobility in some way or another. So we have this idea that biometric identity uses are in this kind of border context really quite different from what we might think about them in terms of, for example, financial transactions and how these are supposed to be sort of protected from fraudulent use. Indeed, Iteangi Ashume, the UN Special Rapporteur on racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance into the United Nations, has pointed out in her special report that governments and United Nations agencies are developing and using emerging digital technologies in ways that are uniquely experimental, dangerous, and discriminatory in the border context. And that she adds here that this sort of immigration and she adds here that by doing so, they are subjecting refugees and migrants, stateless persons, and other human rights violations, and extracting large quantities of data from them on exploitative terms that strip these groups of fundamental human agency and dignity. So really, we are faced here with a very serious problem. And the question that we're posing is trust in this kind of situations a design problem? And I'll hand over to Karolina here. Choose mood.
Thank you so much, Fran. Indeed, regarding the question of whether this is a design problem, legislation seems to say yes. And allow me to share just 3 legislations out of, if we look at those, we could stipulate that basically legislation is really focusing more on the safety of the system than on the safety of migrants, which we think it's rather indirect. Could you maybe move ahead, Fran? Thank you. So the first legislation I would like to look at is the GDPR. GDPR, specifically with respect to biometrics, is not explicitly focusing, for instance, on facial recognition, which is one of the most controversial technologies, as you might know, in the border control context. Although it's not explicit, it covers as a means of collecting and processing, for instance, personal biometric data. And biometric data is categorized as a special category, which requires more principles and more duly justified protection. It needs to be proportionate and subject to safeguards, including human rights impacts. The second regulation is the European Data Governance Act, which has already been proposed. It's not yet enforced, but there have been long discussions regarding border AI and specifically, for instance, facial recognition. To what extent a potential ban of facial recognition technology as such would be acceptable or would be important from European values perspective. Despite this long discussion, in the current text, the European Data Governance Act allows for facial recognition as a technology, especially in border control. So, and the third regulation is the European Artificial Intelligence Act, which has, of course, already been proposed. There's a large discussion about it. One of the most important parts is that it has a very broad definition of AI in order for allowing a broad inclusion of future AI technologies. However, when we look at the text, for instance, one of the main goals is to prevent reasonably foreseeable misuse. And that's also applicable of border AI technologies. Yet, when we look at this formulation, then we can manifest that this is rather about the safety of the system than about the safety of potential data subjects. With respect to the border AI technology as such and the European Artificial Intelligence Act, competent public authorities are in charge, of course, for designing, operating, and of course, overseeing these technologies. What we can see, however, as you see these points, that the risks assessment regarding these technologies are, again, highly technical and only indirectly focusing on the livelihoods of migrants. So, considering these three regulations and the framing of the problem, to what extent is border AI a trust issue, then we could consider that regulation, although it focuses on the safety of the system and not directly on the safety of humans, it becomes an issue already on the level of the European Data Protection Board and also on the level of the European Data Protection Supervisor. What we have seen in our studies and in literature manifests, for instance, through this formulation that the European Data Protection Board and the Supervisor call for a ban on the use of AI for automated recognition of human features in publicly accessible spaces. The very fact that such an authority calls for banning a complete ban of use of AI in public spaces, which also includes border AI, led to for us to question the extent to which what type of methodologies would be there that make it possible to create room for taking human features into account within designing border AI technologies. So regarding the fact, how can we think of from the responsible design angle, what would be necessary to take into account for designing border AI that accounts for the human features and basically the human safety? We took into consideration the guidance ethics approach. This approach has been developed by Peter Paul Verbeek and Daniel Tijink, and the main purpose of this ethical guidance of technology manifests in first focusing on the context. So technology is perceived in light of the societal problem that it needs to address, and the border control context is a very specific one. So that's stage one. In stage two, the interactive dialogue and ethical reflection of all actors of the quadruple helix are required according to this approach. Just to highlight the quadruple helix in this case are the governments, academics, industrial parties. In our case, migrants would also be highly important to include, which also is a requirement under the European Union's high-level expert group guidance on trustworthy AI. So all these actors and their involvement and their ethical reflection would lead to action options. Action options to either change the design of technologies or to either change the environment, which is in our case border control, and potentially adapt the behavior of users. And just to make sure in our case, we not only consider users as officials operating these systems, but also those who are the subject of the system and who are most dependent upon these technologies, such as migrants. Now I'm handing over to Fran.
So now if we're taking this kind of prerequisite of saying, okay, if we're trying to develop responsible and trustworthy border AI, we need to, at a minimum, take a kind of approach like the one that Karolina has just presented us with. We actually get faced with a number of different problems. So the first one is already connected to the stage one of this process. If we're trying to think about this technology in its context, what we're dealing with is a highly politicized context where the role of border AI is potentially to execute really not quite 100% clear decisions being made on the political level. Indeed, in the migration literature, we have very little consensus on how exactly migration ought to be regulated and what exactly ought to be some markers of individuals for being sivered out of the border context as being potentially dangerous or making fraudulent claims. And in the end, what we have not only a highly politicized context from the side of government concerns, but we also have a context that is potentially one of life and death stakes. In earlier discussions, we've talked about this idea of thinking about those that are most vulnerable in the system. And this is really what it boils down to when we're talking about the border context. So once we get to stage two, this question of creating a dialogue between all of these various different stakeholders, we really get into this question of how to involve the most disadvantaged and how to identify them. If we're quite liberally talking about the migrant as affected by these biometric systems, we are being highly imprecise. Earlier nods towards intersectionality, but also ideas such as superdiversity point out that the political positioning and power dependencies are really going to be quite different for different types of migrants and in different times. And these are things that are changing continuously, which might not be possible to write into a system as such. So the criteria for clearance at the border might become non-negotiable once they are actually integrated into these systems, which takes away from or which kind of assumes a certain amount of predictability of migration movements that we simply, in empirical terms, have not been able to witness. And then we get to the third stage of this process, where we're looking for options for action. So let us just assume we've managed to integrate all of the stakeholders, including those who are most disadvantaged. Then what we might find is that it is likely going to end up in an irreconcilable situation where the use and implementation of border AI may be troublesome even after the consultation process. So border AI then remains the shaping ground for migrants' exclusions and life chances, potentially. So where does this leave us in terms of conclusions?
So with respect to the guidance ethics approach and potentially, as we have seen, the exercise of thinking through this approach, how to design border AI more responsibly and potentially more in a trustworthy manner, as Fran highlighted, the political context can be taken out of the picture. So it would lead potentially to rethink the policies around migration as such. However, on the other level, guidance ethics, in our view, could help to rethink what is needed for migrants and in order to take their biometric traits and other behavioral traits into account, so that it's meaningful not only for those hosting countries and those hosting authorities who decide about them, but also who would allow for room so that the systems themselves become also meaningful, so that migrants can show their human vulnerabilities in order to be able to take that also into account. It could also allow for rethinking criteria for design for potentially more trustworthy border AI if we would take into account these livelihoods.
Or for that matter, if we did take that kind of approach, we might find that the technologies that are being developed go in a completely different direction rather than one based on digital identities. And with that as a kind of concluding remark, we very much look forward to questions, comments, insights. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you both for a very interesting talk. It doesn't look like I've got any questions at the moment. So obviously a really hot subject. With your own research, where are you hoping to take next? Fran, maybe?
Yeah.
Well, for me, the question is how does this kind of sip into other contexts than just the border is the way that we're conceptualizing it. If we're thinking about the airport context, yes, we have very particular kinds of ideas about what might be achieved and what the market share of some of that technology is. And to be frank, if we're talking about that market share, some of it has nothing to do with the kinds of concerns that we are with reading the body of the individual, but more with reading out technologies which have sort of other problems of potentially not working on particular groups, and quite often are problematic if looked at from an intersectional or diversity perspective. But what happens if we're really kind of thinking, okay, these systems are meant to, as it was really in the keynote at the beginning, emphasized, meant to become highly interoperable and start working in various different places, then how does that in the end affect the seeping of the border into really contexts where we might not necessarily be thinking about it at the moment, and that we might not necessarily pick up on early enough to actually act on and redesign the technologies that are being used. So that would be where I would like to take this.
Brilliant. Very interesting. Thank you very much.
What I would be interested in regarding the trustworthy AI aspect of it, to what extent can, for instance, in this context, the border context, the mistrust in migrants as a baseline be taken into account, and rather reshaping it that allows for room so that migrants, for instance, could renegotiate or change the perception about their livelihoods and about their profile and potentialities, so that it allows room for, for their potentialities and life chances to be taken into account.